So that's a little bit about the people who were there. All right. Let's talk now about what happened. It actually happened. Okay. So I don't know if you guys ever heard of Equiano Olaudah. Yeah. Equiano Olaudah was probably one of those foremost people in the struggle against slavery, the abolition, and along with people like Wilberforce and others, he was, out there. Okay, so he wrote this book called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, okay, which is his African name, his birth name, or Gustavus Vasa, okay, the African. All right, and in it, okay, he describes how he was in a village in Igbo land, okay, growing up. He describes, what he experienced growing up, what he experienced when he was captured, okay, and what happened, on the way to the coast, what happened in the slave ship, what happened when he came here, okay. So if you allow me to read a little bit of what it is inside of this book, okay, I will start coming on page 22 because, time is you don't have all the time in the world. Okay, this is a stamp commemorating the 200th anniversary of the 1807 Act, Slave Trade Act in Britain, okay, which really led to the abolition. Okay, so there was this big celebration, the Queen of England and all of these things in 2007. It was all over the BBC and so on, celebrating 200 years of the Slave Act. Okay, all right, so starting on page 22, all right, if I read a little bit, and feel free to ask questions or interject, all right? So he was talking a little bit about life in the village and things. So he's now talking about, what they do primarily. Okay, so he explaining why it is, these slave raids happen. So he said our tillage is exercised in a large plain or common, some hours walk from our dwellings. And all our neighbors resort to it in a body. Okay, there are no beasts of husbandry, and their only instruments are hoes, axes, shovels, beaks, and pointed irons to dig with. Sometimes we are visited by locusts. We're talking about, where they farm, okay? Sometimes we are visited by locusts, which come in large clouds so as to darken the air and destroy our harvest. This, however, happens rarely, but when it does, a famine is produced by it. I remember an instance or two there wherein this happened. This common is often the theater for war, and therefore, when our people go out, he talks about it, okay? So from what I can recollect, he talks about the reason why, people fight because their agricultural land is destroyed, okay? So from what I can recollect of these battles, they appear to have been eruptors of one little state or district or the other to obtain prisoners or booty. Perhaps they were inclined to this by those traders who bought the European goods I mentioned among us. Such a mode of obtaining slaves in Africa is common, okay? And I believe more are procured this way and by kidnapping than by any other, okay? So basically kidnapping on a massive scale, okay? When a trader wants slaves, he applies to a chief for them and tempts them with his wares. This is not extraordinary, okay? If on this occasion, he, which is the chief, yields to the temptation with a little fairness and accepts the price for his fellow creature's liberty with as little reluctance as the enlightened merchant. Accordingly, he falls on his neighbor and a desperate battle ensues. If he prevails and takes prisoner, he gratifies his avarice by selling them. But if his party is vanished and he falls into the hands of the enemies, he is put to death. For as he has been known to foment their quarrels, it is thought dangerous to let him survive, and no ransom can save him. Okay? Though all other prisoners may be redeemed. Okay? So they will kill the king of who or the chief of whoever is raiding them if he loses. You see what I'm saying? So this is one of the aspects of life back then. Okay, so now he explains how enslaved Africans were treated in Africa itself. Okay, so he went on to describe a victory that they had. Okay, so he says that the spoils were divided according to the merit of the warriors. Okay, those prisoners which were not sold or redeemed were kept as their slaves, as I was explaining before. Okay, and how different was their condition from that of the slaves in the West Indies? With us, they do no more work than other members of the community, even their masters. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly the same as ours, I guess, except that they were not permitted to eat with those who were freeborn. Okay, and there was scarce any other difference between them than the superior or the head of the household, okay, which the head of the family possesses in our state, with that authority which, as such, he exercises over every part of his household. Some of the slaves even had slaves under them as their own property for their own use. You see? So, this is, the general context. And he comes back to this often. All right? Let me get some water. Any questions? So far, so good. Okay. So he now talks about when he was captured himself. Okay? So he said generally, remember he's about 11 years old at this point. Okay? He says, generally, when the grown people in the neighborhood were gone far into the fields to labor, the children assembled together in some of the neighborhood premises to play. And commonly, some of us used to get up a tree to look out for any assailants or kidnappers that might come upon us. For this sometimes took those opportunities of our parents' absence to attack and carry off as many as they could seize. Okay? So he goes on. One day, when all our people were gone out, to their work as usual, and only I and my sister were left to mind the house. 2 men and a woman, okay, got over the walls and in a moment seized both of us. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouth and ran off with us into the nearest woods. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could until night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshments and spent the night. Now think about this for a second. You living in a situation where people could come and take your children and you will never see them again. Think about that, right? You're living in Trinidad, right? You have kids, yeah? And, at any time, people could come and grab up the children, yes? Go on and never see them in life again. Yeah? How traumatic is that for the children? Okay? And we'll say how traumatic is that for the parents when they come back. Right? And that was the experience of millions of people, basically, who encountered, this situation. All right. So then came the long march, of course. Right? So the captives were often chained, around their hands and necks and forced to walk hundreds of miles. hundreds of miles, because Africa is, one of the biggest continents. Okay, and it took them several months to reach to the sea. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Now during that journey, they would be sold and resold to others. You see, families would be split apart. If you like Equiano and his sister were both captured together. Okay, after a few days, they were sent different places. Okay. Many sick and enfeebled were abandoned along the way. You see? So this is another engraving from the 1600s, right? And imagine you walking with a stick around your neck. Okay, and if you notice here, it's good to go through these things. You'll see, the guy still has the stick around his neck, the yoke around, and just left to die. If you notice in the background, okay, I have the links to these photographs as well on the PowerPoint. If you notice in the background here, you will see some hyenas just waiting for these people. Yeah, and that was common practice. Okay. Now, so I showed you guys Elmina. The Portuguese, the Europeans set up forts all the way along the coast of West Africa. In Ghana alone, okay, in a space of 250 kilometers, there were 80 of these forts. Okay, the forts initially served the purpose of defending the territory from other European aggression, but it quickly turned into slave castles. You see, where they house people. Okay, like how the Jews were stored in these ghettos. Okay, before the trains took them to the extermination centers, they were stored in these castles for months before the ships came and took them over to the Caribbean or North America or South America. Okay, so in Ghana alone, you have 80 castles of this size. No big things, 32 are standing today. Okay, and these are pictures of some of the slave castles in different places. So this is, all of these things here are in Ghana. This here is in Senegal, Gorée Island, Bonsi Island. Okay, is not standing today, but this is how it looks. In Cape Verde, this is Real de San Felipe. Okay, and this is how it looks today. Okay, all right. All right, there are some pictures of what happened inside of these slave houses, these slave castles. Okay, so this here is in Gorée Island. All right, this is the door of no return, because when you left here, that was it. That was the last time you saw the African continent. Okay, and here we have the Obamas, of course, standing up in the door of no return. So this is Gorée Island here. All right, so let's now go and explore what actually happened in some of these caves, some of these dungeons.
But for 24 hours and 3 months of the stay in the dungeons, all the African men were in shackles and chains. If you are in shackles and chains, holes around here, which will be the only source of light and air, will have no net covering. So there were flies that always entered the dungeon. Diarrhea, dysentery, malaria fever, and several other diseases were very much in abundance amidst people. You are going to make an effort moving from where you are to that bucket, but because of the shackles and chains on you, you'll be slowed down, the population will slow you down, you have diarrhea. Defecating yourself is very easy. That is why majority of the African men and women have to even stay where they are, defecate there, urinate there, and sleep there. And they will be fed twice a day. But you don't eat with the plate, you eat using your palm. And know that these hands will never be washed. Because their last bath was taken about 31 kilometers away from here at a place called Asset Slave Market. You take your last bus from there, you walk from there to here. Even driving to that place takes about an hour. How much more walking? By the time you end up here, you are already filthy. And food they gave them was nothing to satisfy anybody, but to keep them going from time to time. Because of all these, you will sometimes find African men and women dead in the dungeons. They will never bury them. They just pick up the dead bodies, take them out of here, and drop them into the sea. And because it was so dark in the dungeons, whenever African men and women were taken out, they normally became partially blind. They couldn't see properly. But when slavery was almost over, the Europeans decided to stop cleaning the dungeons of the castle. So African servants who were supposed to clean, whenever they moved the population in the dungeons out, they came here instead of cleaning, rather to cover everything up with sand. Know that what we are standing on is the original floor made up of bent bricks and trenches. But then in the other rooms, everything you are going to walk on will not be the original floor, because it's covered up with feces, urine, food particles, and so many things, which there came a time they covered it up with sand. And whenever they brought African men and women back into the dungeons, everything was so high that they're going to walk on top of it, but it will be at your ankle level. Well, wonderful people. The floors of the dungeons were built a bit higher than each other. So the first floor is higher than the second, and it continues in that order. There are trenches all over the place which move liquid waste from each room. So looking at the whole thing, it means that every liquid waste from the first room enters the second, third, fourth, fifth before it enters the sea. How much more the waste from all the other rooms which will end up in the fifth room? The stench from it, the heat from it, and all of that. Because of all these things, people fell really sick. And as I said, people died. But then know that the mortality rate was so high because all these Africans that came here were very strong men and women. They survived this. And when they survived this, they ended up surviving the ships, ended up in the Americas and survived it. And today we are here. So this tells all of us here that we are from the strongest of the stock they took.
Okay, one interesting statistic. For every person who died on the ship, 6 to 7 Africans died on the land. Think about that. Okay? For every person who died on the ship, 6 or 7 died in conditions like this stuff here. You understand? And on the journey. All right? A little, whoops,
but
let me just.
24 hours and 3 months.
Okay. So.
Hey, DP.
Yeah.
What that means is that out of every 20 African slaves who were captured, only one made it to the other side, boy.
Okay, so I have here how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Okay, this was the title of Walter Rodney's book. Okay, there Radford has it. All right, and this was one of the primary reasons, because the people they took were the youngest and the strongest. Okay, and they took huge numbers of people. Okay, right? And this was one of the primary reasons why the continent took so long, to catch itself. Okay, there are places in Ghana today that are devoid of people. Okay, people do not live there, specifically because these were places that people were taken from. So it's like, haunted places. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so a couple more shots I have of, so these are the shackles that were used in the place. All right.
So Roger,
Yes.
so and maybe Radford could comment on this too. So in that book, do they have an idea of like what the actual population was before that trade? Because it had to be a lot of people.
There's a lot of people. I hadn't researched that, but I could look for it and put it forward next week. Okay.
Because I'm just thinking from an economic standpoint. If you, as Ahmed had said earlier, if you that's your cargo and that's your your commodity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So this is the point that same guy who was talking about just now was making in another part of this video. It is a mystery why it is you would treat your cargo in this manner.
Because it must have had a lot of people that they just
exactly
make abundant.
Exactly. Didn't care really. You know what I'm saying? I really think about it. We didn't care.
Jack hit it on the head many times already, so we know that. We know is the reason.
But the thing is, I didn't want to go there right now because evil really rests in the hearts of man, because European people did this, but African people, they do Rwandan genocide, you know what I'm saying? Right? And, Cambodian people did the Cambodian thing, right? And Stalin himself up the road there did a whole heap of other things. So it's not just one group of people.
Yeah. No, we understand that. We understand that.
So, this year's Elmina Castle, I was looking at Zainab, what's Zainab's name? She's on the BBC. Badawi, yes. So she was making a tour of the Elmina Castle. And this guy was taking her around, okay? And he was showing her the female dungeons, okay? So the female dungeons are in here, okay? And every time the governor felt like he needed some sex, okay, he would come and stand up here on top of this this ledge here and point to a lady downstairs, and they would, take her out of the crowd, beat her down and so on, and carry her upstairs for the governor to have his way. Okay, so basically the female slave quarters was his harem. You see what I'm saying? But more than that, and the guy made a very interesting point. If the governor of the castle did that, what do you think his lieutenant and his other people did? You see what I'm saying? Right? So this is interesting. All right? But the story hasn't yet finished. Yes, because they still have to go onto the ship. Right? And that in itself was another situation. Because as you see here from this 18th century engraving, it was licks to get onto the ship. You see?
This might be a good transition point to end today and resume on the next day. How are your slides looking for time for today?
Well, it's 8 to the 6. I wanted to go until 9 and or a little before 9, and we could talk about it afterwards.
Okay,
unless people want to stop and continue next week, because I know it's a lot of stuff I put out there. Okay, so what let's take over. You guys want to stop, or you guys want to continue for the next 15 or so minutes?
I'm good with continuing.
I'm good until 9, so that's fine.
Me too.
Okay, so let me just continue this and try to hustle it through. Okay, because I just have the experience as they got onto the ship. Okay,
don't hustle it through. Don't hustle it through. We want to. We're enjoying it.
If Arthur Griffith ain't telling you to stop, you keep going.
All right. Okay. All right. So like I said, this year, they didn't have cameras in those days. Okay. So men just drew what they saw. Yeah. Okay. And there's the slave ship in the background. All right. So Equiano, going back to Equiano boarding the ship. All right. So he's on the sea. All right. So he said the first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea. He never saw the sea before. You understand?
Right.
Okay. And a slave ship which was riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which soon converted to terror. Okay, which I am yet at a loss to describe. And then feelings of my mind when I was carried on board. Okay, I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I was sound by some of the crew. And I was now persuaded that I had gotten into the world of bad spirits and they were going to kill me. Their complexion too differing so much from ours. Their long hair and the language they spoke, which was different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment, and this is important, that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with all of them. Okay, I would to have exchanged my condition with the meanest slave in my own country. You see what I'm saying? When I looked round the ship, okay, and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, a copper, you know the copper we used to have in the yard, the big copper, okay, and a large furnace of copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenance expressing dejection and sorrow. I no longer doubted of my faith and quite overpowered with horror and anguish. I felt motionless on the deck and fainted. Okay, so that was his experience, okay, on the ship. Now, this is about the last little thing I have here. So let's do a little video of the journey across here. Okay, so this I believe is an undersea monument. I'm not too sure. I think it's like off the coast of Grenada or something. I'm not sure 100%. Okay, so there's a little something I put together.
We close in just before the ship arrives on the African coast to get a clear view of the conditions that approximately 600 captives had to endure on their 2-month middle passage to the Caribbean. The Aurore was a typical 18th century slave ship. The main deck shows 2 key features designed to control the male slaves. First, the barricado, a 9-foot high wooden wall that divided the ship in 2. This was topped with spikes and swivel guns. Second, 2 iron chains can be seen running along the upper deck. Every morning, the crew brought the shackled male captives up onto the deck from the spaces they had slept in overnight. The crew locked the main shackles into the chain to restrict movement. African men were not only chained in place, but continually within the firing line of the swivel guns. African women and children were imprisoned behind the barricado, normally unshackled, where they could neither see the men nor speak to them. Fearful that the male captives might escape their chains and try to capture the ship, the majority of the crew also remained behind the barricado. We descend from the quarterdeck to the officers' quarters and galley. A cook prepared the slaves' food in this boiler. The captives' diet consisted mainly of a starch such as rice, beans, or flour. Enslaved people were forced to eat this monotonous diet twice a day. They drank just 2 pints of water daily, leading to constant and often deadly dehydration. As the sun began to set, the crew, armed with whips and guns, forced the slaves below deck. The space below was divided by wooden walls to keep the men and women separated. The men were released from the deck chains and forced below, still shackled in pairs. Once below deck, Crewmen packed the enslaved men together. Some were forced to lie on top of the platforms, around the side of the room. Others lay under the platforms. Each captive, on or under a platform, slept in a space just 14 to 18 inches wide and 30 inches high. Most were forced onto their sides.
So if you really think about it, the height is about 4 feet. Okay, you'll notice that there are no windows, okay, in this space. All right, so you know it's about 2 feet from here to here and about 2 feet from there to there. Okay,
and pressed against their neighbors. Others sat in their meager intervening spaces. Platforms.
Couple of other things.
Each captive, on or under a platform, slept in a space just 14 to 18 inches wide and 30 inches high. Most were forced onto their sides and pressed against their neighbors. Others sat in their meager intervening spaces. The Aurores prisoners spent at least 14 hours in such cramped, dirty, and stifling conditions, which they endured daily for 2 or 3 months before reaching the Caribbean.
So those pots and stuff you saw on the floor, those are the stuff that they had to defecate in. They had to do all the business in those pots. Okay? So here's another thing I got. It's about 2 minutes. So let's just listen to it.
Before boarding the ships at African port cities, enslaved people were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions and had their heads forcibly shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, enslaved people lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch those enslaved who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, enslaved people would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unchained in their designated compartments, and children often free to move about the ship. There were no sanitary facilities of any kind. Enslaved people were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged the enslaved and crew members alike. The enslaved people generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender, also subject to forced exercise, which sometimes included dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Enslaved captives deemed disobedient were tortured and beaten, usually whipped with the especially cruel cat o' nine tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Enslaved people who refused to eat their typical meal of rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with a speculum oris, a medieval tool used to force open a person's mouth. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World, carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful.
Okay. All right. So I would just like to end this presentation with something from the Black Panther.
Maybe we can still heal you. Why? So you can just lock me up? No. Just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ships. Because they knew death was better than bondage.
Yeah. So this was at the very end of the movie, of the Black Panther movie. Okay? And it had some real significant truths in
They
it.
spoil the movie for me. Me and watch it yet now. You show me the end.
Well, there's a lot of other stuff in the movie that you will also find quite interesting.
I just
Right?
joke. I just joke.
Okay, so let me see if I can come back to this. All right.
So in the end, he said something to the effect that death is better than bondage. I couldn't hear it
Yeah.
quite so well.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what he said.
Yeah.
Okay,